We're a small nonprofit based in Oakland, but serving all of California and trying to support building more better housing for our lovely state of California. In particular, we're really interested in ADUs as a really fabulous way to create more housing, give people more flexibility in the homes they already have, create generational wealth. And they have a lot of really wonderful sustainability benefits as well, which leads us to our session today. So without further ado, I would love to introduce our speaker today. Amy Rousseau is with the California Energy Commission, and she's worked with them for over 5 years. And she's worked with building inspectors and all different types of folks, helping contractors, home inspectors to provide guidance on how the building energy code applies to their work. She's also the editor for the California Energy Commission's Blueprint newsletter, and we'll post a link for that in the chat so that you have access to it today. We're really fortunate that Amy's here today to help break down the 2019 Energy Code and how it applies to accessory dwelling units. Amy, thank you so much for being here.
Hi, Hannah. Thank you so much. And thank you to Build It Green for offering to have this class today and getting really great, getting the word out there and having people get registered and interested and involved with ADUs. We really do appreciate that. As Hannah said, my name is Amy Rousseau. I am with the California Energy Commission. I've actually been there now 6 years. And I've been working on outreach for the Energy Code for more than 4.5 years. So I'm excited to be able to give this presentation to you today. Also, as Hannah mentioned, we will have moments where I'll pause and ask if there are any questions. So if there is anything that does come up, feel free to put that into that Q&A, and we'll make sure that we get your questions answered. We also will have time at the end. So as we go through, if you think of something, we'll definitely have time at the end to make sure questions are answered. Okay, so today on the agenda, we have first just a review of what the Energy Code basics are. Then we're going to look at some ADU definitions, and we'll look at some of the requirements that are specific to ADUs when they're defined as an addition to an existing building. And then we'll look at the ADUs for newly constructed, brand new builds. I'll have some modeling tips for you. I don't know how many of you out there are very familiar with the modeling software for modeling the Energy Code, but we will have those tips for you. And then we will look at what it looks like when that Energy Code documents go into plan check. And then I have a bunch of resources for you at the end. So we'll keep this under the 2 hours for sure. And we will make sure that we get all those questions answered. So starting with those basics, we're currently in the 2019 Energy Code cycle. It became effective last year, so it's been in effect just almost 1.5 years now. And it will, this code cycle will go through all of this year and all of next year as well before the next code cycle takes effect. So any building permits that you are getting submitted from January 1st of last year until then, we'll have to use this 2019 forms and software that we have. All of our documents are online on the Energy Code website. So we have all of the actual Energy Code available for PDF download. We also have reference appendices that have a lot of great information in them. And then we all have compliance manuals. So the residential compliance manual is a great tool, has lots of graphics and Q&A to help you decipher the Energy Code. We recognize that it is not always the easiest code to understand. And then we have our forms that you do need to fill out in order to be compliant with the Energy Code. So we do have some fillable dynamic forms, but most of the forms that will be associated with ADU projects will most likely go through the modeling process, and that modeling software will actually create the forms. Speaking of forms, we do have several different types of compliance forms, and they're completed by different people during the process. So at the beginning of the process, we might have designers and energy consultants completing the CF1R form, which is what you give to the building department at the beginning when you're trying to get your permit. Then we also have certificates of installation, and those certificates of installation are done after those components are installed, and they're usually done by the installing contractors.
We have certificates of acceptance as well, which are done by a third party. We call them HERS raters, which is Home Energy Rating System. And those HERS raters provide a third party inspection of certain parts of the building. And so those are called CF3R forms. We're actually going to look at some of those CF1R forms as we go through the presentation. So energy code requirements have two different types of measures. We have mandatory measures and we have prescriptive measures. The mandatory measures have to always be met. There's no trade-offs for the mandatory measures. And then we have some prescriptive measures, which means that we've already set a package, a predefined building things that would, if you do everything exactly, your building will pass energy code. And though there is some flexibility there, because we know that maybe everybody doesn't want that exact same style or items in their building. So in order to have some flexibility, you can either, like I said, just do everything exactly using that prescriptive approach, or we have the performance approach where you can take that modeling software that I mentioned and you can have some flexibility, and there are some trade-offs that you can do. Maybe do a little bit better window and maybe not as great of another aspect, maybe your roofing product. You can trade off in certain parts of the energy budget in order to make that building comply. For 2019, one of the things that changed with that modeling software is what we call an energy design rating. And this is just rating a building, giving it a score between 0 and 100. 0 is actually the better score. So 0 is going to represent that zero net energy home. And 100 is actually not the best score. So we're anticipating that most brand new homes in the 2019 energy efficiency code cycle, when they do everything that they are required plus add PV, that they'll be in that 15 to 20 something range. But there is pathways also to get down to 0 if you were looking to do a Z&E home. I mentioned the performance approach several times already, and this is where you can do use the modeling software and have some trade-offs. When you're doing that approach with the ADU, there are always some mandatory measures that must still be met, and one of those is in IAQ, which is indoor air quality, and that has to be HERS verified. There are going to be mandatory insulation requirements, and then there will be some duct insulation requirements if you're doing a new HVAC or any type of HVAC work. Like I said before, there are trade-offs that are allowed in certain areas. This little graphic here on the right-hand side is an example of the compliance software. When you look to see if it's complying, you can see here it's actually comparing on the right-hand side the standard design, and on the left-hand side the standard design, and on the right-hand side the proposed design, and it'll show if it complies and what the percentage is. So you'll see that this actually says pass over here on the very right-hand side, and it's passed with a percentage of 1.9%. That's the compliance margin there. So it's not very big percentage that they've actually passed. So if anything was to be not correct, you don't have a lot of room there to make some corrections on that software. Well, we're going to talk a lot more about compliance modeling in just a bit. If you are working on any of that compliance modeling, we do recommend using the most recent version of the software. We have different approved versions. I've listed here both the residential and the non-residential, but for ADUs, you'll most likely always be using the residential versions of the software. So the CVEC Res is the free version that the Energy Code Energy Commission offers. Then there's Energy Pro and Right Energy that are also two other versions. These are paid versions, but they have different features and different kind of bells and whistles that the CVEC Res may not have. So definitely always check for the most recently approved version. A lot of times we fix maybe workarounds, and we make little things that make that modeling software work easier and is easier to comply. So we want to make sure that those approved versions are being used. If you do have any questions about modeling and maybe there's something that you're stuck on. We do have software support for each of the different types of software. So we definitely recommend not only the user manual for CBEC Res, but there's an email you can email with CBEC Res, Energy Pro, and WriteSoft. So feel free to use those whenever you are doing the modeling, and get those questions answered so that you can make sure that your building is modeled correctly and complying. When you get the presentation PDF version, all of those little underlined links will be live, so you'll be able to click on those little orange links and be able to have those live links. Okay, great. We are going to talk about ADUs specifically now, and we're going to look at some definitions and clarifications in this next section. So really, hopefully, help you define what that means when we're relating it to energy code specifically. So the first definition I want to talk about is low-rise residential, because we do consider ADUs low-rise residential buildings. So we define that as a single family and duplexes of any number of stories. And then multifamily and townhouses, we define that as no more than 3 habitable stories. All right, now let's look at accessory dwelling unit, which is ADU. It's a secondary dwelling unit on a residential lot that's usually under the residential R occupancy. It's through the building department, that's how they classify it. It can be attached, it can be detached, or it can be converted, but it's independent living space separate from that primary dwelling on that residential lot. ADUs can have many names. I've heard all kinds of different names for them. So it's not necessarily specific to a certain type of name. And what we've done with the energy code is choose to call them accessory dwelling units, and it can encompass any of these different types of properties. But the main thing is that it's a secondary dwelling unit on that residential lot. So for energy code compliance, there's different kinds of ADUs, like I said, but some of them may or may not have to meet energy code compliance. So if it's an ADU or junior ADU, an efficiency unit or factory built home, those all should be meeting energy code. But there are also some HUD and HCD requirements. So HCD is has requirements for manufactured housing, mobile homes, and factory built. So that's the Housing and Community Development Department in California. And they do have some specific requirements for those types of housing, and some ADUs may fall into those categories. And then if it's an RV or trailer, so if that ADU has wheels and it's not permanently located somewhere, it could also be classified as an RV or a trailer, a park trailer, and it may have to meet some other requirements that are national requirements. And in that case, it may not be required to meet energy code requirements. I have some resources for you at the end. I'll have some links to some HCD documents that help define when it needs to meet if it's manufactured or mobile home or factory built or RV. It helps define and clarify those and helps you decide whether it's going to need to meet some of these other parts of code. And when we're looking specifically at energy code, we define a newly constructed building as a building that's never been used or occupied for any purpose. So it's basically going to be a brand new ground up built structure. We define addition as any change to an existing building that's increasing that conditioned floor area plus conditioned volume. It could be a newly conditioned space, so that means it's converted. So it's converted from that unconditioned space to a conditioned space. So that could be a garage conversion or basement conversion. And it also can be an alteration. So any change to a building component that is a component that has to meet energy code requirements. So that could be the roof, it could be the HVAC system, it could be the windows, it could be any part of that building that has energy code requirements. So let's look at some ADU scenarios. We can have both attached ADUs and detached ADUs, but when we're talking about energy code, we want to really look at these. So if it's an attached ADU, it can be connected to, it's going to be connected to an existing dwelling unit. So it's going to have some sort of common wall or ceiling or floor that's attaching it to an existing dwelling. It can be an addition. So we have an existing building and we're adding on to it. It can be an alteration. It could be maybe it's already a conditioned basement and now we're going to change that into a separate dwelling unit. But it's never, when it's attached, it's never considered newly constructed because you're attaching it to something that's already existing. And then we have detached ADUs, which are going to be separate. There's not going to be any shared walls or ceilings or floor. It's going to be completely separate from that existing building that's on the property. So it could be newly constructed, which means they built it from the ground up, or it could be an addition, which means that it's newly conditioned space, newly conditioned or converted space. Okay, so we are actually, because a lot of those scenarios, the first 4 scenarios I just gave you were additions, and that really happens to be probably the most common form of an ADU that you'll see. We're going to look at some of the things that are special with additions first, and then we're going to go, after that, we'll go over some of the things that will be with new construction and newly built ADUs. So let's look at some things that have to do when that ADU is now considered an addition. So one of the things is when we do have an addition, we do have some modified requirements. So you will have to meet all of the requirements for the U factor and SHGC for those windows and skylights that are the same as a new building, but some of the modified requirements have to do with how much fenestration or windows. Fenestration is also means windows. So we have some different requirements depending on the size of that ADU. So these requirements are slightly less stringent than what it would be for a brand new building. So depending on the size of the ADU, it will change how many windows you can put in and how many can be facing west if it's a certain climate zone. The hotter climate zones have a limitation on that west facing windows. Some of the other requirements that are slightly different for additions, maybe we have some modifications here that you can do, have to do with the walls and the insulation. So if it's a wall extension, so you're extending an existing wall, maybe you're extending it out along that same plane or you're extending it up along that same plane, then you have some less stringent requirements for that R value. So if you have a 2x6 wood frame, you can put R21 and you're not going to be required to put continuous insulation, where if it's a brand new building, you will. And also, once you turn the corner on that wall extension and it's a brand new wall, that requirement is going to be different. You will have to put that continuous insulation on the brand new portion. So your walls may have different requirements depending on how they're attached to the structure. Another exception is for QII, which means quality installation. We'll talk about that just a little bit more when we get to the new construction. So there are a few exceptions on those existing walls. If there's already windows and doors, you don't have to insulate those headers. And then there's no air sealing required on that existing wall if you haven't changed the air barrier. So you haven't maybe deconstructed that wall, then you don't have to worry about the air sealing on that existing portion. So all of this has to do with existing walls that we're talking about. And then on additions that are less than 700 square feet, we do have a few other modifications you can make that have to do with that ceiling insulation, a little bit less stringent there. Also depending on what climate zone you're in. And then QII, which is that quality installation, will not be required on those smaller additions, so less than 700 square feet. We can touch on that a little bit more. These are mostly for those extensions of existing walls. All the parts that are brand new, that brand new wall, that maybe you're extending out a roof and it's more than 700 square feet, all of that brand new part will need to meet the same requirements of a new building. All right, let's look at a couple more things. In regards to the roof, as I mentioned, when you're extending out that roof, and now this requirement is specific to more than 300 square feet, So the new portion of the roof may need to meet solar reflectance and thermal emittance requirements depending on the climate zone. So really for ADUs, you may find a few that have low slope, but I would say the most part people would be using a steep slope roof. So that's only climate zones 10 through 15. And there are some exceptions as well to that. There's ways to get around it. We do have a brochure for this. And when you have the PDF, that'll actually link right to the brochure. You can click on it to help you out there. But we do have we try to make it easier for those additions to comply. Oh, one mention, let me just go back real quick, for cool roofs. Depending on your local jurisdiction, you may have a cool roof requirement. I know County of LA has a cool roof requirement in addition to the statewide requirement. So always check with your local jurisdiction. A lot of the local jurisdictions have a more stringent code, have approved a local REACH code. So there may be sometimes that there's something that's just within your local city or county that is a little bit more stringent. So something to remember. All right, let's talk about that space conditioning equipment. So when you're putting an ADU in, and it's an alteration, and you're going to go ahead and put a new space conditioning system in, you will be required to do duct insulation and HERS testing and of all of these things. And then there will be an air filtration requirement and that mandatory requirement of MERV 13 air filters. We're going to talk a little bit more about the air quality requirement. If that new addition is not, if you're using some existing equipment and you're not touching these things, then those won't be required. But let's talk about the ventilation, because this is the one part that's going to always be required. So anytime they're adding a new dwelling unit, whether it's an addition, an alteration, or newly constructed, it's a new dwelling unit, it's going to have mandatory ventilation requirements. So that's for single family detached, it's for those attached additions, it's for multifamily, it's across the board. Whenever we're adding a new dwelling unit, it will have this requirement. And this requirement is actually related to ASHRAE. So what the Energy Code has done is we've kind of aligned with what ASHRAE's requirements are for that indoor air quality. And we use the number of bedrooms as a way to calculate that. And so even if it was a studio, we want to consider that that's at least one bedroom. So there'll be, even though it may not be an enclosed bedroom, there is a space for somebody, a person to be sleeping. So sleeping quarters in a studio would be considered a bedroom. So we always want to have indoor air quality. And this is important when we look at the modeling and the calculation, and we're going to look at examples of that as we go on. Again, some of the ventilation may be in the kitchen area. So when you're putting in a new kitchen vented range hood, there will be some requirements there. Again, these are requirements aligning with ASHRAE. So HERS verification will be required for new kitchen vented range hoods. There are if it's not a vented range hood, if it's another type of kitchen fan, then you may have some less stringent requirements, and it depends on if it's an enclosed kitchen or not. And I have a little definition of enclosed kitchen because I do get asked. This is not an Energy Code definition. This is an ASHRAE definition. So an enclosed kitchen is a kitchen whose permanent openings and spaces do not exceed more than 60 square feet. So if it's a small galley kitchen, it could be considered an enclosed kitchen. But if it's that open floor plan, then it's not going to be an enclosed kitchen. So you just want to make sure that if it is enclosed, you have these options down here at the bottom of 300 CFM or 5 air changes per minute. Again, these are always, these are mandatory requirements, so these cannot be traded off. A couple more that we're going to talk about, and then we'll answer some questions. So water heating, we do have some water heating options when you do an addition. You can do a gas or propane water heater, but we're going to, if you're doing gas, it's probably going to be that instantaneous water heater. It's not going to have storage. Storage water heaters are allowed, those gas storage water heaters, but you'll have to meet some additional efficiency measures to make that work. And if you are choosing to do gas, you're going to have some heat pump ready measures, and we're going to talk about that, what that means in just a moment. If you're doing an electric, heat pump water heater is allowed. It has to be high efficiency, and there's some additional measures that you can meet. And it also has to be located inside. So where that location of that water heater is important. So let me talk a minute about that heat pump water heater ready requirement. This is a mandatory requirement if you decide to go gas, if there is already gas there and you're going to put a gas water heater. You will also have to put an outlet so that in the future, if they choose to do all electric and switch it out for a heat pump, that they're able to do that simply. So basically, you're just allowing that there's a plug there already to change it out to a heat pump in the future. We'll talk about that again when we get to the new construction. All right, just a couple things about lighting, and then I'm gonna ask you guys a question and we'll take some Q&A. So lighting, again, this will be anytime that you're adding lighting in addition, we'll need to meet the requirements. What those requirements really boil down to is we're probably going to be putting in LED lighting. That's what we consider high efficacy lighting. We do have some requirements in our JA8 tables, and there's some labeling on that lighting that's called JA8. We do have some additional requirements if it's an enclosed luminaire or if it's a downlight, with, like a little light that's in the ceiling. Those also have additional requirements. We do have a labeling that's JA8 2019, but if it was also labeled JA8 2016, it will still be accepted for this code cycle. So anything that says JA8 2016 or JA8 2019 is acceptable. What you're finding on the shelves, if you were going to the store to buy that, or you're looking online to buy it, is mostly LED type of lighting that you're going to find that will meet those requirements. Now let's answer some Q&A that have to do with additions before we move on to the new construction.
Great. This is probably a good point to plug, and maybe we can put it in the chat, that the California Energy Commission does have a hotline where you can call or email if you have specific questions. If we don't get to them today, you can follow up at any time. That's a free service to get those very specific questions answered if we can't help you today.
That's absolutely correct. And you can also, if you already have like, your plan set or pictures, anything else that helps describe your specific scenario, it's always helpful. The more information you have, the better we can answer your specific question.
Quick question, are kitchen non-exhaust recirculation fans allowed?
No, if it's used to meet the indoor air quality, no, it would not. It does not meet indoor air quality requirements. So most of the time they're not really being installed for that. If there's another fan that's meeting that indoor air quality requirement that's sufficient, that's not the kitchen exhaust fan, then it can be installed. It's a little tricky.
Great. One quick last one. Do small 2-burner induction cooktops require an exhaust fan?
This is actually not part of energy code. I think there's another part of the health and safety code that requires that kitchen ventilation. I think some sort of kitchen ventilation is required. The energy code just makes the ventilation be more energy efficient, but I believe that it will still need ventilation even if it's electric.
Okay, now we have a number of questions about hot water heating. So this one is, what if you don't have the space or ventilation requirements for heat pump hot water heater, but you don't want to run a gas line? Are there electric resistance options for a detached garage conversion?
So if it is an addition, and we're not talking about new construction here, there are ways to use an electric resistance, but you're going to have a lot of efficiency to make up with some other way. So there are ways. It's more challenging. You might have to do a heat recovery ventilator or some other type of efficiency in order to make it possible. But that scenario is only possible when it's an addition. It's not allowed for new construction.
Great.
We do have on our online resource center, which we can look at when at the end, if we have some time, we can go to our online resource center. We do have a handout for water heaters that's helpful for that, for additions and alterations, for water heater change outs, that helps with some of the water heater stuff.
In general, if the option is available to build attached or fully new construction, will the energy requirements be less stringent in an addition?
Yes, they're a little bit less stringent in an addition than brand new construction.
And one last one about heat pumps. You mentioned that heat pump hot water heaters have to be installed inside. I thought that exterior, but within an enclosure was also appropriate.
Yes, that is true. So if it's in an enclosure that has enough space to recover that heat, then it is allowed. But we don't want it just actually outside exposed, not in some sort of enclosure. It should be, they generally say to put it like in a garage, which I know most ADUs don't have a garage, but you could do an outdoor water closet. I believe our last blueprint actually had some, which we can also look at it at the end, blueprint, but this is our newsletter we send out with little Q&As and pictures and stuff, and we talked about water heater closets. So we're actually going to look at ADUs in new construction, and we're going to look at some things really that kind of came up with 2019 code cycle that will have to be looked at when you're talking about a brand new ADU, and some things that are different than if it was an addition. So the first thing we're going to look at is QII, and I mentioned this, so it's quality installation, which is a tongue twister, which is why we try to just say QII. This is now a prescriptive requirement. Because it is prescriptive, you can trade it off, but you'd have a lot of efficiency that you would have to make up somewhere else. And it's not always that easy to trade off. So it is required. So we're talking here about brand new construction, brand new from the ground up. We're not talking about those additions or alterations that we were talking about before. So this is a brand new from the ground up, not attached to anything else, ADU. So it's probably most likely you're going to have to do QII, which means you're going to have a HERS rater come in and do that third-party inspection, but they'll come twice. They'll do a verification of the air barrier, and then after that's completed, they'll come back and do the, after the insulation is installed, they'll look at that as well. So there's 2 checkpoints there for that HERS requirement of QII. Again, we talked about some of the water heater things, and we're going to talk about them from the perspective of brand new building. So we did make this parallel pathway for prescriptively. You can have that mixed fuel home, or you can have an all electric home, but when we're looking at all electric, it's probably going to be a heat pump because it's really hard to overcome efficiency for that resistance. So you're probably not going to find that electric resistance is going to meet any of the requirements if you try to model that. So with the heat pump, it's most likely going to be an NEEA Tier 3 heat pump water heater. If it's not, there might be some additional efficiencies you have to meet those requirements. I did, in this presentation, I'm clearly not going into depth on every different topic because it's just a lot to cover. I'm just trying to hit the most important points to look for. But there definitely is a lot more to energy code, and that's why we definitely recommend, if you have more questions, to send them to our hotline so we can look at your specific scenarios. Again, I mentioned this when we looked at the alterations, but this is the heat pump ready. So if you do have that mixed fuel home, you go with the gas water heater. You're also going to have to add this outlet, so that way in the future they could replace it with a heat pump water heater if they wanted to and go all electric. Again, that option for the gas and propane, if you're going that option, it's probably going to be an instantaneous water heater without the storage. But if you do want to use that storage water heater, there are some additional efficiencies you're probably going to have to make up for. I know in most ADUs, there's not a lot of room to put a big old storage tank, so you probably are looking at those instantaneous ones as a better option as far as space. For the heat pump, because it does require some additional space, and because we do want it to be enclosed, it could be more challenging to put that type of a thing into a small space like an ADU. I know most of them probably are not going to have attached garages, but if they do, it's a great place to put the water heater if you're able to. But if you don't, we do have that option of a water heater closet or using that gas instantaneous. Okay, I know PV was mentioned in Q&A and we didn't really get to it, but we're going to talk about it right now. When it's a brand new building, it will require PV. It is something you could try to model and try to offset with modeling, but you're probably not going to be able to do that. We're going to expect that most new, brand new from the ground up is going to require PV. Now, there may be some exceptions to that. If there's a lot of shading and maybe this ADU is between two really tall buildings and it's never going to get sunlight, well, that can be an exception. Also, if it's in a disaster rebuild area, some of the places that had fires in previous years are considered a disaster rebuild area, and there may be some exemptions there for the PV. That was only for the year of 2019 right now that's approved, and this is Assembly Bill 178 that was approved. They are trying to extend that for the year of 2020, fires that happened in 2020. So it may be extended, but right now it's only for the fires that happened in the year of 2019. We're going to talk just a little bit about those exceptions and some other PV requirements. So a PV system is based kind of on how much roof area you have. And I know ADUs are small, so they often don't have a lot of roof area. So the PV panels can be located other places. It doesn't necessarily have to be on the ADU. If there is a garage, it could be on the garage. If it's the primary dwelling unit, the panels can be there. They could be ground mounted if that's allowed in your area. Some areas don't always allow that. So if that's allowed, it could be ground mounted. But the one thing is it does have to be a new system. It can't be that existing, the primary dwelling has an oversized system and you want to share it. It can't be shared. It has to be its own system. It has to be new panels. You can add new panels to an existing system to meet that requirement, but it can't be just an existing system that you're sharing with. There has to be some new component that's added for that PV in order to qualify. We are going to try to clarify that a little bit too in the next Blueprint newsletter we're sending out, because we do get this question a lot on our hotline. So we don't necessarily through energy code require a new meter, but some utility companies may require a new meter. The only area that has a community solar option is the SMUD utility, and that's the Sacramento area. So if you're in that area, you may look at that option. But otherwise, we're going to expect to see PV. Again, it might be a smaller system because if there's only a limited amount of roof space, you could downsize it and have just a smaller system. I know there's going to be some PV questions, so I don't doubt that some of you are already typing those in.
Yeah, we have a few about solar. This is not a specific dwelling unit question. So this person asks, if it's something like a quote art studio that's new but doesn't have a kitchen, would it qualify as new construction and trigger the need to add photovoltaics, or would it be considered an addition?
Well, at the beginning, they said it was new construction. It was a new structure. So it's going to depend on how your jurisdiction, your building department is classifying that. If they're classifying it as residential use, it may trigger that PV. But if they're classifying it as a different type of building, not necessarily a residential use, there's lots of other classifications they could give it. That will determine on if it's triggering energy code. If it's classified as residential use, then it's probably going to trigger the PV.
Great. Must PV serve an ADU only? Can new PV be shared with an existing building? And can new photovoltaics for an existing building be used for PV requirements for an ADU? I think I got all the parts.
Okay. Yes, the PV should be specifically designated to the ADU, and it should be sized specifically to that new ADU. So in other words, if they're trying to do an oversized system so that they can also do something with the primary dwelling unit or other buildings on the property, it's not going to be sized correctly for that ADU. So that should be its own a separate permit. So you should have one permit that's specific to all of the ADU requirements with the PV. And then if they are wanting to add additional solar for some other use, that should be on a different permit that's specific to that other building and that use. So they should be separate.
Next question. Does a new ADU sharing a common wall with an existing detached garage require PV?
No, because if it's sharing a common wall, we're considering that an addition, and ADUs that are considered additions do not have to meet PV.
Can the new PV, this is a different question, can the new PV be used to power the main home and not an ADU?
I think we already kind of addressed that, but the answer is no. It should be on this permit that you're going to request from the building department, that PV will need to be sized specifically for the size of that new ADU. The only time that maybe that could happen is if they're building a brand new primary house and a brand new ADU at the same time on the same permit. And then that it's possible that those could be permitted at the same time together, and that PV would all be considered for both of the dwellings. But no, if there's already a primary residence and now you're adding an ADU, it would need to be its own system. Okay, yeah, let's talk about some modeling, and then we're going to look at some plan check, and then we'll have some time again for Q&A at the end. I have some resources for you that should be helpful too. So I've added in some slides here that I actually haven't given to anyone else. So you guys are the first ones getting this modeling tips for ADUs. So let's look at a few things. First, like I said, our CBEC Res modeling software is a free download through our website. And we also have a user manual that goes with that. And in that user manual, there's several places that are really specific to ADUs. And these are just tips to help you when you're modeling to look at. So in the user manual for that CBEC Res, Chapter 4 and Chapter 10 have some really, really good information about how to model ADUs. So just for your reference, you want to look at those. All right, so let's revisit our little pictures. I know we went through these earlier, but let's look at them all on the same page and kind of really digest some of this information. So over here on the left, we have what those new constructed ADUs are going to look like, detached. And over here on the right, we have additions. Now, additions can be attached or detached depending on the existing building. So there are some other options there, but we do have more scenarios in those additions. And then of course, there are those alterations if it's already a conditioned space and we're converting it. All right, so I just wanted you to remember this before we talk about how we are going to model it, because how we enter it into the modeling software really depends on if it's new construction or if it's an addition or alteration. Okay, so the first thing we're going to look at is if it's an addition or alteration. So when we're entering into the modeling software, I have a little sample of one of the screens in the modeling software over here on the left. And there's all these little tabs across the top Hopefully you can see my little pointer, I'm pointing to them. And this happens to be the one that I have opened here is the ADU tab. So there's actually a little tab that says ADU. And this tab is to be used when it's an addition or an alteration. So we want to use this tab in this scenario. So an ADU, when it's modeled in as an addition, I mean, if it's attached to the home, we're going to identify it as an ADU. And there's two ways to do that. You can do an addition alone or an existing plus addition. So that means that maybe you're changing some components in the existing building as well as adding on an addition. And then you would input the existing building details, and we will look at what that looks like when you actually print out the form, the CF1R. So we're going to look at that in a few minutes. So you're going to input the existing building details, like the existing building square foot, the existing building's number of bedrooms, if it has any. And then you're going to use the ADU tab to enter the ADU details. So the ADU will have its own square footage and the ADU will have its own number of bedrooms. And it has to be at least one for an ADU number of bedrooms. Then you can't enter 0. When it's converted space, whether it's attached or detached, again, similar, you'll identify that as either an additional loan or an existing plus addition. You're going to input those existing building details, and you're going to use that ADU tab to enter the ADU details. Okay, so when it's new construction, you're going to enter it just a little bit different. So because it's new construction, we consider this a brand new building. So if it's a detached ADU, brand new built, we're not going to use that ADU tab. We're just going to look at this building all alone. And we're not using that ADU tab. So we're just going to enter the ADU as the primary building and do the square footage and number of bedrooms that way. When a brand new building ADU is built and we use that ADU tab, the indoor air quality calculation gets messed up. The newer versions of the CBEC software are now giving an error message. So that way, hopefully people are correcting it right on the front end and not having it go all the way to plan check and having this issue. Now there is one caveat, and I kind of mentioned this earlier, when you're building a brand new primary dwelling unit plus an ADU at the same time, that would be the only instance where you would use the ADU tab for new construction, because you have a primary dwelling unit plus an ADU being built on the same permit at the same time. So that's the only time that we would use the ADU tab for new construction. But I don't think that scenario happens a whole lot. And that's the only time that maybe you can calculate that PV together. But I think most of the time that's not happening, but it could happen. So we just want to let people know we understand it can happen. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about the CF1Rs, and then we'll take some more questions. So let's do what it looks like when we get to plan check. You've already done your modeling and you've printed out your CF1R. You're going to take that down to the building department with your plans. Let's see what happens. First, let's review, because again, we're going to ask the plan checkers to determine, is it modeled correctly? Did they model it as new construction? And does it meet one of these scenarios? Or did they model it as an addition? Does it meet one of these scenarios? So that's the first thing we always tell the building departments. Let's make sure it's in the right scenario. And then the first thing I have here for you guys is an actual plan check. This is an actual plan check that a building department sent to us to ask a question about because they weren't sure if it was correct. And I know this looks really tiny, and don't worry, I'm going to zoom in because I can't read that tiny stuff. Let's zoom in. So this is an actual plan check, and you can see right up here at the top, they've called this project ADU. And that's actually just a title. And those of you that do energy code modeling know that you could enter whatever name you want. You could enter the property owner's name. You could enter the address as the name. You could enter your dog's name. It's just a name. So even though it says ADU there, that's just a name, and that may not actually be the correct way to model it. So let's look at some of the other points that we would look at on this CF1R. And so this is a performance run that was done and given to the plan check department. And this happens to be the first page, page 1. And the first thing we're looking at here is on line 12 and then line 16. So when they have selected that this is an addition alteration, and they, when they input this, they said that the existing square footage is 0 of the existing building. And that can't be 0 when we're modeling an ADU as an addition. We need to know what the existing building square footage was. And the second thing that we're going to look at is on the ADU tab, they did not enter the ADU information. So the ADU bedroom count on line 20 is showing 0, and the ADU conditioned floor area on line 21 is also showing 0. So these are incorrect as well. So if this was an addition or alteration, what we would expect to see is that there's an existing building square footage plus an ADU square footage. There should be something in both of those. And then the number of bedrooms on the existing building should be located on line 13. I don't have that one highlighted, but in this instance, it shows a 2 on line 13. And then the existing number of bedrooms on line 20 should be at least 1, or if there's more, if it's a larger ADU, but the minimum up there should be 1. Let me look at one more thing on this particular one. This is the page 2 of that same report, and it has the HERS features summary. And one of the things that's missing on this summary is actually that indoor air quality. So what's missing, it should show here that indoor air quality needs to be verified by HERS rater, and it's not showing that. And again, 100% of the time, it's going to be required for an ADU. So it didn't calculate that correctly, and it's not showing that it needs to be verified. So this was one that we sent back and said, oh no, they need to redo this. They need to make these corrections. So this did not pass the plan check. It got correct. It went back with comments for corrections. So let's look at example 1. I made an example 1 for you guys that was done correctly. So this isn't an actual project, but I made an example 1 to show you. So this one was modeled correctly. So let's look at the differences here. So the same lines, we're looking at line 12 and line 16. This one, we said we're just doing an additional loan. We're adding on an ADU, but the existing structure is 2,100 square feet. So line 16. Also, I didn't highlight it, but on line 13, it also shows the number of bedrooms as 4 in that existing building. Additionally, they went ahead and used that ADU tab correctly, and they modeled the ADU square footage as 400 and the bedroom count as 1. So those were modeled correctly. Let's look at the next page of this same example project. Here we see that HERS feature summary, and this is where we would show that we indeed have that indoor air quality requirement. And this one also is saying we're getting a brand new kitchen range hood. So we want to make sure that that also is getting that HERS verification. So there's 2 things there that are going to be required for the HERS verification. So I do have some resources for you, but if you, do you want to pause here and I'll answer some Q&A, or do you want me, the resources slides go pretty quick. So what do you think, Hannah?
Sure, let's do the resources, and then we got a whole hodgepodge of questions for you here, Amy.
Well, good, and we'll have plenty of time to make sure we get everybody's questions answered. Okay, so just some ADU resources specifically. I mentioned earlier that there may be instances where HCD is going to be involved because of the type of tiny home that it is. So HCD, which is the California Department of Housing and Community Development, has a few handbooks and handouts for you guys. And these are links, so when you get your PDF copy, you'll be able to link on these. Sometimes the links are funny with your PDF. You may have to copy and actually paste the link into your browser, depending on what browser you're using. But we have an accessory dwelling handbook. We also have a factory built handbook. They also have some other questions about tiny homes and other information on their website. So if it's some sort of a manufactured or factory built or other type of ADU, maybe that's not going to be like permanent, then they may have some other requirements that you may have to meet. So some good resources there. Another great resource is we have a partner, Energy Code Ace. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with them, but I'm going to talk them up again in a couple more slides. But they actually created this quick reference accessory dwelling unit handout, and it has some of those scenarios pictured in it. It talks about some of those exceptions we talked about when it was an addition. So some of those wall and attic exceptions, some of the window exceptions. So this is just a great resource for you. I have the link for you if you wanted to download it. I mentioned before we have an online resource center with lots of great resources. In fact, I mentioned we have a water heater card, which I'm going to go ahead and see if we can look at that real quick. That was an actual link in the PDF that you'll get. I went right to the online resource center. I'm going to scroll down just a little bit, and I'm going to look for water heating because it is one of our little categories here. I'm going to click on water heating, and we want to look at the 2019 code cycle, so the standards. We're going to open that one, and then we have a water heater efficiency guide, which is very helpful, but the one that I was referring to had to do with water heater alterations. So let's click that one. We'll open that guide for you. And this answers some questions here about water heater alterations, what can and can't be used. So that's a great resource for you. The other one, going back, is this water heater efficiency guide. Again, has some really good information about different types of water heaters and what the efficiency guide requirements and ratings are for them. So this is, again, another handout. You may also have noticed on this same, sorry, 2 clicks back, under here, there we actually have a presentation about specific to water heating, and we'll talk more about water heating. So if you were interested in that, feel free to come back here at your leisure and look at some more information about water heating. On the online resource center, you noticed I scrolled down. There's other categories as well. We have solar and lighting and envelope, all their own categories. So you can go in here and click on any of those. And be able to get more information about any of those topics. So great resource for you guys. Come back over here. I have another resource for you guys, which is our Blueprint newsletter. I mentioned it several times. It's a quarterly newsletter. You can subscribe and we'll email you every time a new one comes out, which is only going to be 4 times a year because it's only quarterly. But specific to ADU, we've actually been talking about ADUs for quite a while now. So the most recent issue is this one you see here on the right-hand side. This was the one that just came out at the first quarter of this year. We're working on the next one getting published here before the end of June, probably. But you can see here, we talk about ADUs quite frequently. So these are the blueprints that we've talked about ADUs in the last couple of years. So there's lots of ADU questions that come up, and whenever we get one that's asked on really often, we try to make sure that we print it in our newsletter. So if you click on this link, it'll take you right to our Blueprint newsletter page. We can open this up and see this current issue right here. We'll open it. This is the one that I just was talking about that came out this year. And you can see right here under this, in this issue, we have a Q&A about accessory dwelling units. And these are some of those scenarios that we just went over today in our presentation. So we answered some more questions about those scenarios specifically. So again, another way, a great resource for you guys, and hopefully these are helpful things that you guys can refer back to. So let me go back to the presentation. Just a couple more resources, and then we're going to answer a bunch of questions. We definitely want to stay connected with you. In addition to that email list, we have other email lists if you're interested in what's going on with our appliances or the blueprint, the building standards, the 2022 energy code. We have lots of different emails you can subscribe to, or any of these social media websites. We have a great media department that posts stuff all the time on the different social media sites. So feel free to follow us on any of those. And then As was mentioned earlier, we have that energy code hotline. We want to be able to answer your questions. So we are constantly answering questions that are very specific or very general. So whatever your question is, you're welcome to call. I do want to let you know we are all working from home, so it'll probably have you leave a message and they'll get back to you. Or you can send your email. The great thing about the email is then you can attach, if you have a picture or a diagram or something, you can attach that and give us as much information as you need, and we'll get back with you. We are slightly understaffed, so it's taking just a little bit longer on the response time, but we will definitely get back to you. One more resource that's a great resource is the Energy Code ACE. As I mentioned, they have that quick reference handout. And I know they have some other great resources for you as well. And they do lots of trainings and they have everything they have on their website is free. All the resources are free. And they are really a great partner that we have. And again, this links right to their page, and you can even search in their search feature ADU, and you'll come up with all kinds of resources specific to ADUs. So definitely a great resource. I do want to go ahead and answer some more questions though before we finish, and we have a good amount of time, so we can make sure hopefully to get everybody's questions answered. If we need to, we can go back to any of the previous slides, or we can look more on the website if there's specific things that you want to look at. And if we have time, maybe I can even go back and look in some of those questions we're going to follow up on for the heat recovery ventilator and for that 2022 PV question.
Yeah, so we have a number of modeling questions, and I know that modeling is not your specialty, but I'll ask them, and if we need to, we can direct people onward. So we have one: if converting an unconditioned garage to an ADU, does that mean the existing conditioned floor area equals 0 in that case?
I think it's going to be, I think the numbers would be the same. That they might actually, you'd put that existing building, so say that was 1,000 square feet, and then the new ADU is also going to be 1,000 square feet because you're converting that entire area. I believe they're both going to be the same. But one of the things I can do is we can, I just want to show you, since you said there's going to be some other modeling questions. I'm going to go back to our online resource center here, and I'm going to go to the 2019 compliance software, and we're actually going to look at the user manual for CBEC. This is where you can download it, but this is also where we have frequently asked questions, and we have a user manual.
Another kind of clarifying question: when converting a detached, non-conditioned garage to an ADU, do I use the main house conditioned floor area and number of bedrooms?
Because we do have an existing dwelling unit on this property, that's probably what we need to put in. Sorry if I'm changing my answer here. I didn't necessarily think the whole thing through. But now that we have a better picture of the scenario, whether it's attached or detached, we do want to use that existing primary dwelling unit as our existing space, because every property will have that existing primary dwelling unit, or it couldn't be considered an ADU. So that's the square footage we want to use, whether it's attached or detached. For the ADU, whatever space we're converting, that is our ADU square footage. So that would be the correct answer for both of these questions, actually, whether it's detached or attached. That you would use not the existing garage square footage, but the existing house square footage, the primary dwelling is what you want to input. And then your ADU will be that converted garage square footage.
Question: would a studio ADU still need to list at least one bedroom on the certificate of compliance that you shared?
Yes, because it will have, even if it's a studio and that bedroom is not separated with walls, it still has a sleeping component to it. So yes, you would consider that one bedroom, even though it's open to the living area.
Can I model a new single house in addition to a new ADU in CBEC Res all in one model?
Yes, you can. And that's when you would use, that's the only time you would do new construction and use the ADU tab, is when you're doing 2 brand new buildings at the same time.
Okay. A solar question. Does a new photovoltaic system for an ADU require an entirely new separate system, e.g. converters, panels, etc., or can new panels be tied into an existing system?
New panels can be tied into an existing system, but you have to make sure that the new panels are sized correctly, specific to the ADU square footage, and that your utility company is okay with you not having a brand new meter and other components.
We have a few questions about junior ADUs that were way back from the beginning.
Okay.
And one is just, what is the difference between requirements for ADUs and JADUs, or junior ADUs for those who aren't familiar? And are the energy requirements as stringent for junior ADUs as for ADUs?
So energy code doesn't define the junior ADU versus ADU. I think HCD is the one that actually defines that better than I can. Right here on this page, you can see it says what are ADUs and what are junior ADUs. Again, this isn't something we define with energy code, but this is a way to find the answer for you. So they're defining them here. We have ADUs defined up here. Again, they talk about them having many names, and then junior ADUs. So let's look at that junior ADU definition. It says that they're created within the walls of a proposed or existing single-family residence, no more than 500 square feet. It says they may share central systems, contain a basic kitchen with just small plug-in appliances as opposed to a full kitchen. They may share a bathroom with that primary dwelling unit. So those are some of the things that make them a little bit different. But because it is a new dwelling unit, there will be an indoor air quality component that's going to be required for that space that's specifically the junior ADU. It's not the shared space.
Excellent. We have another sort of HCD related question. This says early on, factory built homes were listed under both must comply with HCD HUD standards, housing and urban development standards, and quote, must meet energy code. Where can we learn more about what qualifies as factory built housing and which agencies will be enforcing different parts of the energy code and HCD standards to the unit installation on any project?
This does come up often, and which is why I gave you the resource here on the presentation that goes to their handbook. So they have their, let me go back to the presentation. They have the factory built housing handbook, which again addresses more of that. Oops, here we go. Let's see. Let me see if it'll let me open it. All right, so this is the factory built housing handbook, and this is where they have some definitions, and this is published by HCD, and they do go over some of the definitions here of what factory built housing is, and you know, what the requirements are and what the responsibilities of the local government. So this really is going to go into more detail. We definitely don't define those things for energy code specifically, but there are instances where a factory built housing may need to comply with some parts of both codes.
Excellent, thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, and there is a lot of detail in this document on that for anyone who's interested.
Yes, there is.
Totally different question, actually from the same person. Is there any requirements for soundproofing in ADUs with shared or common walls?
If there is, it's not part of energy code. Insulation can provide some soundproofing, but we don't, that's not the reason we're requiring insulation. We're requiring insulation for the efficiency of, you know, the heating and cooling, not having that indoor outdoor air transfer. But we do not require soundproofing. I don't know if other parts of the residential code do, but it's definitely not part of the energy code.
So in some jurisdictions, 2 ADUs are allowed in the same building. Someone is wondering if they can be modeled as a single ADU or if they need to be modeled separately.
So if we're talking about where it's going to look like a duplex, where it's two dwelling units attached together, duplexes are typically modeled separately. Each dwelling unit is modeled on its own.
Someone's wondering if there's any ADU resources specific to Sacramento that you know of, Amy, for ADUs. I'm asking because I think you're in that area.
I am in Sacramento area, and I don't know that there's what there is specific to Sacramento. I know that we have some, especially here through Build It Green. You actually were the one that showed me the Casita Coalition, and I believe that's for all of California.
Oh, it looks like another panelist or another attendee says Sacramento's working on a website and a lot of new resources. They were just awarded an RFP to do that. So that's excellent. Sounds like more ADU resources coming to Sacramento soon. Another attendee says that yes, sleeping areas adjacent to the main building will have some soundproofing requirements. And also someone from the Casita Coalition says the regional government has ADU resources in Sacramento as well.
Great. Maybe they can put some of those links into the chat for people to grab.
I'm looking through the questions. This is about a non-ADU, non-dwelling project. So I think we sort of answered it, but like a new detached pool house or art studio with no kitchen, does solar PV apply?
It's really going to depend on how the local jurisdiction is defining that building. So it depends on really what the local jurisdiction assigns as that building type. So energy code applies to certain types of buildings. PV only applies to residential buildings. So if it's not classified as a residential building, it's not going to have that PV requirement. So it really will depend on the local jurisdiction, how they're classifying that specific building.
Excellent. Someone's wondering where they can find the free modeling software that you referenced. They can't find it online.
Sure, we'll go back. Let's see, let me go back to our building energy efficiency. We're going to find that under 2019. On this 2019 tab, we're going to go down to where it says compliance software. Click on that one to open it. 2019 compliance software. These are all of the actual different types of software are available here. The first one is the CBEC Res, is the one that's free, and you can download it by going to their website. There's links right here. If you keep scrolling down, it has the other two that are also approved, and when you click on their website, they'll ask you to pay a fee for these other two, but they have a lot more features. A lot of people say they're easier to use, they're more intuitive. CBEC Res is not the easiest to learn. It took me a while I'm still learning it, honestly. But I can do some basic stuff on it. But it is free, and it does have a user manual, and you can learn it. There are some great YouTube videos actually that Energy Code ACE puts out on how to model. They have a few that you can just follow along and model the projects, and there's some great tutorials available for modeling. But definitely this is the free version, and you can find it right here on our website.
Awesome. Thanks, Amy. Someone's wondering what the insulation requirements are between an ADU. I'm assuming this is an attached ADU with existing or new conditioned space.
So if it's between, I'm going to assume that's the existing wall, and that's where we had some of those requirements that are less stringent for that existing wall. We have a lot of information in our compliance manual that really talks about that, but one of the handouts that I mentioned was, let's see if we can click here, was this Energy Code ACE handout, and it talks about that existing wall and what the requirements are. It's not going to let me open it. Anyway, so this is a great place to see what the requirements are. So it's really, it can depend on what climate zone you're in, what the requirements are for the walls. But if we go back, I kind of have to go back to the beginning of the slide presentation to show you what the actual requirements are. So it's going to depend on if that existing wall is a 2x6 wall or a 2x4 wall. And it's probably going to be either R21 if it's a 2x6, or it could be R15 if it's a 2x4. So it really depends on the climate zone and what that existing wall currently, how it's framed, and what's going on with it specifically.
So there have been several general questions, so I'm not sure how well we'll be able to answer them about how use of heat pumps affects compliance.
Heat pump water heaters are really efficient. So they'll actually, if you're using them if you're modeling that in the modeling software, they're actually very, very efficient. And so they'll probably give you a very positive compliance margin if you're modeling a heat pump water heater. You just have to take into account where it's going to be located, because it does collect heat from the outside air in order to convert that heat into the water.
Last question is a framing question. So building code now states that walls need to be 2x6 framed and insulated. If we use, and then gives an R value. If we use a material that meets the R value requirements, so basically it hits that performance, can we use 2x4 framing?
If it's another part of building code, like the residential code that you're referring to, or some part of the structural part of the code, and that's the main requirement, then no, our energy code would not supersede that. That code is going to supersede energy code. And if it is required that you have to use a 2x6, then we are going to want that cavity to be filled with that insulation. The only exception there usually is like if it's like a spray foam, and the spray foam per inch isn't going to require as much to meet that R value. But normally we would assume that cavity is being filled with insulation, and if structurally it's requiring, that you have to use a 2x6, then you're going to need to fill up that cavity. So I would say, no, don't revert to using a 2x4 if other parts of the code are mandating a 2x6.
All right. Thank you so much, Amy, and for everyone for all your great questions. I know that we didn't get to all of them, although Amy, you did answer an impressively large number of them. So thank you for that great information. Again, if you have further questions, please feel free to email either us at Build It Green, reach out to the hotline. We'll try to get you connected, get those questions answered. We're just so grateful you joined us today, Amy, and for all of our attendees, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, and thank you everybody for being here.